Figure 3.1b shows the life space at a particular time with both the person P and a goal region G represented. Now, by Lewin's theory, there are forces pushing the person toward the goal region G, as shown in Figure 3.1c by the vector. The dotted line defines P's expected path through two intervening regions and thus involves two different activities. This line defines the psychological distance, in Lewin's terms, between P and the goal. For example, if G is a desire to swim and P is currently at home, then one intervening region may be driving to the beach area and the second walking from the car to the water. These diagrams can be made more complicated, of course, by subdividing more regions, depending on the significance of the intervening activities, and adding barriers, detour regions, opposing forces, and so on. But the essential topological Lewin is captured in Figures 3.1ac. Is this all there is to Lewin's formalization? Essentially, yes. 58 And he worked this simple formalization to death, even though it was fundamentally inconsistent with his ideas. First, his topological diagrams were classificatory and dichotomous, showing presence or absence and contact or separateness, and were thus an application to psychology of Aristotelian science, as he defined it. His diagrams hardly reflected the Galilean approach, continuity and dimensional quantities, he thought psychology should follow. But this is only an inconsistency between his norms and his practice. More fundamental is his use of topology to represent a theory of forces having direction and magnitude, when topology allows no such possibilities. This involved him in all kinds of verbal maneuvers and topological gyrations, simply adding formal complexity to his work without, in many instances, really resolving the theoretical problems his scheme presented, as, for example, how to deal mathematically with spatial distances or a resolution of forces. It was no wonder that attention to the value of his conception was deflected at his formalization, that principles of topological psychology received bad reviews, that psychologists and others have been chased away from engaging Lewin by legions of amoebas and pseudopods, and that, when coupled with his constructs of force, region, locomotion, and barrier, his work exuded an overwhelming physicalistic odor. Very early in his work Lewin recognized the value of mathematics to theoretical work, and particularly the value of geometric conceptions. In particular, because topology could be applied to qualitative and structural concepts, it seemed to Lewin in his early years as the best mathematical representations of his developing theory. Unfortunately, Lewin and his students became locked into this scheme. Even though the theory outgrew topology, they were unable to discard or move around it. 59 Why this was so is partly explained by Lewin's comment that geometric angles, straight lines, distances, and directions usually have no socio-psychological meaning. 60 He simply was unaware of how geometries, such as Euclidean, could be given psychological content and of linear algebra's usefulness in representing his fields, vectors, and distances. This observation is particularly pointed, because at the time, 1939, he made the above comment there was a well-established and vigorous school of multivariate psychologists. 61 Doing precisely the kind of interpretation Lewin thought impossible. In the final analysis, what defeated his attempts at formalization was an intellectual isolation from the mathematical work of other psychologists. 62 And his own narrow acquaintance with mathematics itself. Although my own psychological theory to be presented here differs in many respects from Lewin's, there is considerable similarity in essentials. Especially, the linear algebraic formalization used in place of Lewin's topology corrects the major problems in his formalization and synthesizes his ideas and those of Cattell and Sorokin. In summary, what is Lewin's field theory? First, it is an emphasis on a person's subjective perspective. Second, it incorporates the whole that is subjectively relevant to a person and that organizes behavior, goals, needs, desires, intentions, tensions, forces, and cognitive processes into one system. Third, the elements composing this whole are interdependent and stand in dynamic mutual relationship. Fourth, the key to the dynamic nature of this subjective whole is the idea of tension, energy, systems created by needs and discharged by achieving associated goals. Fifth, The dynamic psychological construct is that of interpersonal forces, which result from the intensity of personal needs and the valence of associated goals. Sixth, blocked goals can lead to increased intention and a variety of behavioral and psychological consequences. And finally, interpersonal conflict is the result of opposing psychological forces. 3.4 Edward Tolman Model advances field theory by considering questions totally ignored by Lewin, such as the psychological interface between roles and culture. 63 Moreover, the use of Tolman's model for the psychological foundations of the Parsonian social theory elaborated in Toward a General Theory of Action 64 gives Tolman's model special interest. Tolman wisely avoids any mathematical pretense. He uses concepts such as field forces, regions, locomotion, and distance conceptually and employs diagrams only as communication aids. He avoids, and given his long association with Lewin it must be purposely, any reference to topological spaces, tautological paths, and he makes no use of pseudo-mathematical equations. Conceptually, Tolman's model generally follows Lewin's theory, except that rather than making genotype versus phenotype and Aristotelian versus Galilean science distinctions basic, Tolman adopts a recenter and more conventionally acceptable theoretical distinction between independent, dependent, and intervening variables. The dependent variables comprise the behaviors, actions, of a person. The independent variables consist of 1. Heredity, age, sex, drugs, endocrines, and so on. 2. Conditions of drive arousal, and 3. The stimuli from the external environment. It is in defining and connecting the intervening variables into a whole with the independent and dependent variables that Tolman elaborates on field theory. In structure, the intervening psychological variables consist of 5 kinds. First, there are capacity and temperamental traits defining individual difference variables, 65, which Tolman conceives of as causally basic to the intervening content variables to be mentioned, but Tolman can do no more than mention them for lack of clear hypotheses providing traits with psychological content. 66. Second, there is a system of intervening variables defining a person's needs. These needs form interconnected compartments containing positive and negative charges of energy. The magnitude of the energy given to the needs, as for example, the magnitude of the hunger or sex need, comprises the tension associated with them, while the energy charges express the readiness to move toward positive charges, or away from negative charges, particular objects. The third set of variables define a belief value matrix. This construct may be Tolman's most significant contribution to Lewin's field theory and is similar to the cultural schema and meanings values matrix of psychological space described in section 7.2 of chapter 7. Tolman's matrix comprises the person's cognitive differentiations, categorizations, types, beliefs, and values, and enables him to know how to satisfy his needs as they arise and to evaluate the objective world relative to them. Although Tolman does not carry this point very far, he does mention that the belief-value matrix can represent the social-cultural beliefs and values shared by the community. 67 If a modal, general belief-values matrix could be determined for a whole society, then it would define a culture's ethos. 68. We now come to a fourth set of intervening variables, which Tolman calls the immediate behavior space. It is dependent upon the other intervening variables so far mentioned, as well as directly responsive to the stimulus situation. That is, traits, needs as interpreted and evaluated by the belief-value matrix, and stimuli feed into the behavior space. A behavior space is thus to be defined as a particularized complex of perceptions, memories and perceptions, as to objects and relations in the behaving self, evoked by the given stimulus situation and by a controlling and activated belief-value matrix, or perhaps several such matrices. 69. The objects and behavior space include the self, and the spatial directions and distances among all these objects may define his mechanical, aesthetic, mathematical, and other interrelations. Moreover, these objects have positive or negative valences attached to them, where a valence is a particularization in the case of an object of a universal value contained in the belief value matrix. 70 Except for greater specificity, Tolman's use of the valence construct follows Lewin. Before describing the dynamic principles involved here, there are two more sets of intervening variables to consider. The first defines a person's locomotion, which is a passage from one region of the behavior space to another, or through a succession of such regions. 71 And it is this passage between regions which is manifested in overt behavior. Clearly, some specificity is called for here, and Tolman is far more careful than Lewin in precisely delineating these central constructs. I mentioned that for Lewin a region seems to mean an activity. This is the interpretation that Leaper gives to it and that Tolman adopts. In his model, the regions of behavior space define the possible behaviors perceived by us as available while we are in a stimulus situation and from the perspective of the region we are now in. For example, this region may consist of a person reading at his desk and the associated perceived objects, desk, lamp, book, and the like, supporting that activity. Now, if this person becomes hungry, the range of activities he will perceive as available to satisfy his hunger will depend on his currently inhabited region, what he is doing now, and on the other activities, and supporting objects, comprising the other regions, such as taking food from the refrigerator, of behavior space in this stimulus situation. The sequential selection of behaviors to move from one region to another region, behavior, is then locomotion in behavior space. The final intervening variables define the behavior space now restructured as a result of locomotion. When a person locomotes from his current region, for example, reading at a desk, to another, say, the refrigerator, the stimulus perceptual situation is altered and the objects and behavior space change. Thus, the newly inhabited region is in the context of a new behavior space, from which subsequent locomotion will take place. There is thus a continual sequence of behavior spaces correlative with our locomotion from one region to another. Figure 3.2, Tolman's psychological field model. I will summarize Tolman's model at this point through figure March 2, 1972. The figure shows the three kinds of variables, and the arrows represent postulated causal connections, the dotted arrows represent feedback. The dependent variables comprise actual behavior, the independent variables are of the three types shown. Intervening variables then denote how external objective stimulus and physiological conditions get transformed into objective behavior. The how is explained by four sets of variables. 73 One set, mainly influenced by heredity and the like, comprises the individual differences the traits people have. These traits causally affect the content of the other intervening variables, but in unknown ways. Another set of intervening variables makes up a person's needs system, say, hunger, sex, or security, which is influenced by external drive arousing or satiating conditions, such as a full meal, and the stimulus situation, such as an erotic story. The need system influences and is influenced in turn by a third set of variables, the belief value matrix. 74 This provides cognitive differentiation to objects and values by which to weight them, and is influence triggered by a particular stimulus situation. Both the belief value matrix and the stimulus situation affect the immediate behavior space, the final set of intervening variables. The immediate behavior space is divided into regions, which delineate the behaviors, and supporting objects, available to a person as seen from a region currently inhabited, and the perceptual objects and his relationships supporting this range of behavior, as invoked by the perceived stimulus situation and defined by the belief value matrix. 75 The sequence of behaviors selected in order to satisfy a need, that is, the movement from one region to another, is called locomotion and is manifested in the dependent variables called behavior. 76 As shown in the figure, locomotion restructures the behavior space. The person is now in another region of behavior space, and this new space in turn influences the belief value matrix, that is, a different set of beliefs values may now be activated. Such is the structure of Tolman's model. What are the dynamic principles underlying it and how does field come in? First, our need system is a source of energy, of tension. When a compartment of our need system, such as hunger, is activated, it develops positive and negative charges corresponding in number to the magnitude of our need. Tension is associated with this activated need and constitutes a readiness for action that will discharge this energy, satisfy the need. 77 Second, this energy activates a need deprivation compartment of our belief value matrix with negative charges. The matrix then points to behaviors, say, eating, and objects, food in this case, that will move the person to a need satisfaction end of the matrix, which will then carry positive charges. 78. Third, a person is located in his behavior space relative to objects and possible behaviors as perceived by him. 79 These objects and behaviors will have positive or negative valences, depending on the values they exemplify in the belief values matrix. Now, finally, to put these components together, the negative charge in the belief value matrix associated with need deprivation is a negative charge on the person in his behavior space. It is, in Talman's terms, a need push evoked in a person and forcing him toward behaviors and supporting objects with positive valence. For example, hunger forces him toward positive valenced foods 80, and away from those with negative valences. Once the need is satisfied, that is, positive changes in the belief value matrix are created, then one is repulsed from relevant positive valenced objects. A satiated person is repulsed by food, for example. Thus, in total, the person locomotes in behavior space as a consequence of a variety of need push forces, activated by needs and directed by the belief value matrix. The field is then the forces in behavior space resulting from the negative or positive need pushes and the valenced behaviors and objects. That is, given a positive valence and a complementary negative need push, there will result a field force tending to repel the behaving self away from such negatively balanced object. 81 The field is then for Talman a configuration located anywhere in a person's behavior space, depending on the state of the energy system at a particular time. This field theory model is a very general one, able to accommodate, as Talman shows in his presentation, a variety of psychological mechanisms, processes, and approaches. For example, learning becomes the acquisition of perceptions of objects, directions, and valences in the behavior space, and eventually in the resultant acquisition of generalized categorizations, beliefs, and values in a superordinate belief value matrix. 82 Moreover, psychodynamic mechanisms like identification, self-ideal, repression, and symbolic substitution find explanation by the model. 83 And the model integrates value standards, Parsonian pattern variables, 84 social roles, and personality. 85 In general, as a psychological field theory, Talman's model is a distinct improvement over Lewin's.